Well, I said yesterday that this race on the Baku circuit, with its three very specific demands, had the potential of being a massive headache for the Red Bull management on the pit wall and in the garage for that matter. And kind of so it proved. Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez head on in the beautiful, glorious Adrian Newey Red Bull RB19. Now, on this occasion, Max started ahead of Sergio, and they very quickly dealt with the pole winner, Charles Leclerc, in the Ferrari, and it became a Grand Prix, a race within a race, an intra-team battle between Max and Sergio. And from the start, because he was in front, and because he made a good start, it was Max Verstappen leading Sergio Perez. But it wasn't easy, and there were already signs by lap 10 that Sergio had the slight advantage. He was making better use of his tyres. I don't want to be boring about this, but it all comes down to how good Sergio Perez was in Sector 1 at Baku. That is not in any way to diminish his drive, his achievement today, because Sector 1 was the key to the lap as driven perfectly in a Red Bull RB19. Incredible use of the throttle, incredible balance of the car on those acceleration runs out of those 90-degree corners. And Sergio Perez was consistently able to match Max's best through Sector 1, or perhaps surpass Max's best in Sector 1, by using the tyres less and giving him more grip in Sector 2. We saw that on the mediums, and we saw it in the bulk of the race on the hard tyre as well. Whenever Max went quickly in Sector 1, kind of matched Perez, immediately he fell away in Sector 2 because the tyres got overheated. Now, from Max's point of view, that added up to the balance not being quite right and having to play around with it a bit. And on the radio, he was saying that he couldn't get the downshifts perfectly balanced with the engine revs, and the team tried to work on that. But it all added up to the tyres overheating, and Sergio Perez not having that problem because of how quickly he was able to go through Sector 1 without abusing the tyres, and that's how he won that race. But let's go back to that first phase before the safety car, because this is the area of the race in which many observers, I think, will say, oh, well, you know, because the safety car came out, Max had made his stop just before that when it was still yellow. And as a result, that's how he lost the lead, and that's how he lost this Grand Prix. Well, let's have a look what happened in the build-up to that yellow. Lap 8, very good example. This is before the intervention of the yellow, before Nick de Vries goes off in the AlphaTauri, hits a guardrail on the left, breaks the left front suspension, then goes straight on. Max Verstappen, Sector 1, 38.2, controlling the lead. Sergio Perez, not trying very hard, looking after the tyres, 38.0, 2/10 quicker than Sector 1. Get to Sector 2, Max does 43.0, as he would. It's his sector. Blind corners, very, very demanding. Narrow entries, narrow exits. Sergio does 43.2. Again, just looking after the tyres, cruising. He's got his advantage in Sector 1. Doesn't need to push the car. Doesn't need to take any risk. Sector 3, pretty much both the same throughout the race. 46.8 was the overall lap time for Sergio Perez. 46.9 for Max Verstappen. And that was the pattern of the day. Sergio Perez always able to make up whatever he needed in Sector 1. And this comes back to, and this is really significant, this comes back to Monaco last year, when Sergio was definitely better on those sorts of corners. It was very clear for the first time in the Red Bull match. We've seen it before in Sergio's career, and we're going back to 2011, but this was very clear at Monaco last year. And I said after Monaco that it's going to be fascinating to see if Max Verstappen changes his style of driving, adapts to what Sergio is doing on these traction episodes. There's no other way of describing it. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that's what it is. It's just traction out of 90-degree corners. Perhaps they could be 110-degree corners, perhaps it could be 70-degree corners, but it's all about putting the power down and not using the tyres. And that is what Sergio Perez does incredibly well, even in comparison with Max Verstappen. Max is probably better in every other department of being a racing driver, but this is one area where Sergio Perez is incredibly good. And at Baku, it gave him the key to the lap because of the nature of the circuit and because of how easy it was to overheat the tyres in Sector 1 and thus give yourself a bumpy ride in Sector 2. And all of a sudden, Max has a bit of a slide. He can start to feel the tyres going. And at this moment, you think it's not going to be long before Sergio Perez is in the DRS and he's going to be pushing him hard. But we never got to see that because the yellow came out with de Vries. They brought Max in straight away. And then as he came out, they decided to go to a full safety car. So he was then unable to make up that ground, having to drive a very slow lap. So by the time all that was sorted, he was down in third place with Sergio Perez now leading the Grand Prix, Charles Leclerc behind him, and Max in P3. Now, Max showed his intention of what this all meant to him at the restart after the safety car. pushing Charles Leclerc like crazy. He got him halfway round the first lap. Beautiful pass, just pulling on the outside coming out of turn 2, and then he did an outside pass into turn 3. So Max is pushing as hard as he knows how through sector 1, and whatever he does in sector 1, Sergio is always slightly quicker or there or thereabouts. And whenever he pushes hard, he then has to pay the penalty in sector 2 because he's overheated the tyres. Whereas Perez, in doing more or less the same sector time in sector 1, hasn't overheated the tyres, and he's got a lot of grip, and he can play around with the car a bit in sector 2 and leave a bit of margin and do what he does. In sector 3, they're both the same anyway, not that difficult. And so that's how the race went. And you look then for moments when maybe Perez was going to make a mistake, lose concentration, or maybe something else was going to happen. Sergio made a mistake going into turn 15 on lap 35, which was part of his transitory curve. He goes slightly to the right before he turns in. This is part of quite a wide entry compared with Max Verstappen, who doesn't do that. He's always looking for an earlier entry. And brushed the guardrail on the right, which is a horrendous thing to do. And guess how Sergio responded? He immediately went purple in sector 1. Nobody quicker all day until that point. And that just shows, I think, how good he was there. He wasn't thinking, I'm going to have to make up a massive gap over Max Verstappen. It was, right, I've got to make up the time I've lost, and I'll do this sector 1 as I normally do it, perfectly comfortable. And it was purple straight away, a tenth quicker than Max, who obviously at that point had seen that he'd gained ground on Sergio, was trying hard, and yet still Sergio was a tenth quicker. And that lap, indeed, was the fastest lap of the race at that point. That lap put in by Sergio. So that shows the sort of control he had and the sort of dominance he had. And because of the layout of Baku, the way the lap goes together, we've got this brilliant traction section at the beginning of the lap. Then we've got this really demanding blind corners, narrow entry, narrow exit, sector 2. And then we've got that really fast sector 3, fast corners, and then long straight. Because you've got those three components, this was a circuit where a driver like Perez, if things went his way, can really focus on what he does well and then let the others just happen around him because he's making better use of the tyres. Now, I'm sure those around him, and indeed Max, will probably say, well, Baku's only one race, the next one's Miami, very different circuit, and then we've got... But we have got Monaco, and I keep going on about Monaco because Monaco is, in my mind, as big a Grand Prix to win as any on the planet. If you're Max Verstappen, you don't want to finish second to Sergio Perez. It's a very prestigious race. But it could well happen, given the way Sergio is continuing to drive on this sort of in this sort of environment, and the way Max isn't responding in the way perhaps that you thought he would. So, yeah, a fabulous, amazing win for Sergio Perez because he had to beat Max Verstappen in a Red Bull RB19. That is the point. And I think he might have won that race even without the intervention of the safety car. I'm not saying he would have, because there would have been some argy-bargy in DRS. There would have been some very sweaty palm moments for the management on the pit wall, because how do you get past Max if you've got an advantage? If your tyres are in better shape, how do you nonetheless get past Max Verstappen in the same race car? So in some respects, Red Bull, I think, were lucky that they didn't have to live through that. Charles Leclerc, for his part, very good job in the Ferrari. And right at the end, super, super quick. He and Fernando, he had pressure from Fernando. And right at the end, Charles Leclerc was doing sector times commensurate with those of the two Red Bull drivers. That's how good he was. Of course, over the lap and over a Grand Prix distance, had he done that, he would have abused the tyres too much. But that's how good Charles Leclerc was. And Fernando too. All the DRS issues solved on the Aston Martin. Still not brilliantly quick in a straight line, but as quick from time to time as the Red Bulls, particularly through Sector 1 and Sector 2. So very impressive drive by Fernando as well. I'm sure Mercedes were going into Baku thinking they might have had a better weekend, but in the end they got blown away by both Ferrari and Aston Martin. Yeah, there were other issues going on, but that's the conclusion that they'll have to draw if they want to be really honest with themselves. Lando Norris finished 9th for McLaren, starting to climb back. You don't get right back into it without races like that one, I guess. And Yuki Tsunoda again in the points in the AlphaTauri. Again, he had a scrappy weekend up until the race, but did a very good job in the Grand Prix itself. But for me, this was a really titanic Grand Prix for me. I love it when there's two teammates in a really good racing car having this sort of fight. Yeah, there were not many overtakes, but it was constant tension. And to watch Sergio's performances through Sector 1, his absolutely perfect use of the throttle under load, very, very few errors through that part of the racetrack, is to watch poetry in motion. Absolutely superb. Max, in Sector 2, when he had grip, was breathtaking, as he would be. And Sector 3, well, for me, Sector 3 is always a bit scary because I've gone on about how speed differential is about the most dangerous thing you can have in Formula One. And there's too much speed differential for me at Baku with the DRS there. It's a really, really quick bit of road. And I'm just so glad that there were no incidents today in that respect.